the other more familiar, more specific stereotypes we might be familiar with. I'll mention three of those. One would be the Jew as bloodthirsty predator, specifically on the most vulnerable members of Christian society. In the Middle Ages, this is often Christian children, Christian boys. So we see this, for example, in accusations of ritual murder and the blood libel. A second specific medieval stereotype would be the Jew as the evil or greedy or wicked moneylender. And we see this in visual and rhetorical and textual representations of the evils of money as Jewish. And a third, more specific medieval stereotype of Jews would be the Jew as a spreader of disease. For example, the accusation during the Black Death in the mid-14th century that Jews were responsible for having poisoned the water supply and thereby spreading the bubonic plague. So I would just note as well that underlying all of these more specific medieval stereotypes, there's not only this understanding that Jews are dangerous enemies of Christian society, but there's also a sense that Jews participate in a conspiracy with one another across geographic distance, one community to another, and conspire in that way to undermine Christian society. For example, in the earliest medieval iteration of the ritual murder accusation, this notion that Jews kidnap and torture to death Christian boys to reenact the crucifixion of Christ, Thomas of Monmouth, who writes about this, he's a Benedictine monk, he says that he heard from a Jew who converted to Christianity that every year Jewish leaders gather, so sounds already, right, echoes of the protocols of the elders of Zion in here, we're in the 12th century, they gather and they cast lots to determine which Jewish community in the world has a turn that coming year in kidnapping and crucifying or otherwise killing a Christian child. So one could say that a final or an additional, there are definitely others, medieval stereotype of Jews is that they're conspiratorial.
So let me ask you a quick follow-up question there, yeah. Paola. You know, you mentioned such a broad geographical scope in where these stereotypes appear. How much variation do you see? And if not too much, I mean, it sounds like you really are able to identify major themes. Why? You know, considering the lack of mass media, people weren't on Facebook all day. How are they getting, how are they sharing in these same negative stereotypes?
Absolutely. So I'll just mention one thing and respond to something that you mentioned in passing, which is that I think that one of the distinguishing features of modern anti-Semitism as opposed to earlier manifestations of prejudice against Jews is that now there is mass media and anti-Jewish hatred plays a role in mass politics in ways that precisely, as you just pointed out, it couldn't because of the technology during the medieval period. But yes, I think overall what's most striking is the continuity and the parallels and the similarities on both sides of the Pyrenees, across the English Channel, from England to France to German lands to Italy. We see accusations of host desecration, of Jews poisoning Christians, of Jews kidnapping and killing Christian children. And I think to get to the heart of your question, which is why, what's underlying this, how does this spread? People travel, texts travel, sometimes we just don't know. But these are, in a way, all of these accusations drawing on some shared foundations in the Gospels and in texts and plot structures that are familiar to Christians from things that they hear as part of their religious culture and are familiar with from that education or that cultural environment. And so the Jews are familiar enemies onto whom it sort of is second nature to project new anxieties and fears, even if what's actually going on it has little to do with actual Jewish behavior. I think that only begins to get to the heart of your question, but it is remarkable how quickly we see some of these accusations spread and across really different cultures within Christian Europe.
There's so much in that answer, but I'm just going to pick out one part. perhaps others will pick out other parts for the Q&A. But you said something about shared Christian culture. And that makes me want to, that really raises some difficult questions about the relationship of Christianity to anti-Judaism. Maybe I'll turn this back to David about whether we can trace this anti-Judaism back to the Christian scriptures themselves.
Yeah, and I would, well, I'll focus on Christianity, but I would say that the same is true of Islam, and for similar reasons. So absolutely we can trace, this is my one resistance to organizing this around stereotypes would be to say, well, you could organize it around ideals as well. That is to say that Christian scriptures, like early Islamic traditions, often articulate their very highest ideals in terms of the overcoming of Judaism, or in terms of a conflict with Judaism, or in terms of Judaism getting it wrong, how do we get it right? And that, what Rosemary Ruther called Judaism as the left hand of Christology, that kind of seeming opposition that emerges in early Christian literature between Jews and Judaism, and Jewishness, or Jewish approaches to things, and the right way to do it, the way that a follower of Jesus would do it. Galatians, for example, so one of the earliest texts we have from a follower of Jesus, is a great example in that it takes the form of a debate between Jewishness or Judaizing. In fact, it coins the word, it doesn't coin the word, but it coins it for Christianity, Judaizing, Judaizing, and it says, Gentiles shouldn't Judaize. Gentile converts to Jesus shouldn't follow Jewish ways of thinking about certain really important questions, like the Christian's attitude towards the flesh, the Christian's attitude towards the law, the Christian's attitude towards the teachings of God in Scripture, etc. So there, all of the ideals of what a Christian should do are, in a sense, being articulated in terms of a foil that is Jewish, that isn't getting the ideals right. And so in that sense, Christian scriptures do place a kind of need to overcome your inner Jew. That's the Gentile, when they follow those things incorrectly, they become a Jew, they Judaize. So the Gentile Christian needs to overcome the potential of their inner Jew, right? To become a good Christian. It puts at the center of Christianity. And that's something that never goes away. It's true in the Reformation. It's true in fact, one might say that every reform movement in Christianity articulates itself as a need to overcome further some residual Judaism in the Christianity it's critiquing, it's criticizing, which is why, for example, Luther, constantly calls the Pope a Jew and a Judaizer, and etc.
It's really, really interesting. This, when we do kind of basic anti-Semitic education, like with children, we're always talking about respect for difference. Anti-Semites don't respect difference. It's not difference per se that's the problem, right? It's that Jews are like an enemy that needs to be overcome that might already be within you. It's like what you're saying gives us some nuance to how we talk about this hate, right?
Well, that's why I think that what makes anti-Judaism so powerful and so persistent, it's partly the stereotypes or the prejudices, the prejudgments, that is the kind of the shape, the containers of thought that the Jew has come. So, and Paula mentioned some of those really important prejudices that have been very persistent. They've even become memes, you might say, like for conspiracy. But what makes it worse, I think, and more dangerous, is that so many of the ideals of our societies have been expressed in terms of the need to overcome Judaism. And I don't just mean our Christian ideals or our Muslim ideals. I also mean, for example, our Marxist ideals, sometimes our Hegelian ideals, our philosophical ideals. Across the Western tradition, many of our ideals, partly because they draw so much from Christian roots and Islamic roots, in other words, religious roots, have taken within themselves this need to overcome Judaism as an aspect of what it takes to strive to achieve your highest ideals.
Can you give some concrete examples? I'm so intrigued by this idea that our, Christian purification or reform movements are about overcoming the Jew. And then you take it even a step farther to say Marxism is about overcoming the Jew. Can you make that a little bit more concrete for us, David?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the key chapter here for any student of Western philosophy and history is the Kant, Hegel, Marx, kind of progression. All three of those figures really thought of the essential work that philosophy had to do in their time as overcoming a residual Judaism. So in Kant, even within any number of his writings, argues that the reason that metaphysics hasn't freed itself from thinking about the thing in itself, etc., is because it's too Jewish. At the same time, Kant's solution is critiqued by Hegel. Hegel, in one of his earlier writings, put Kant among the Pharisees in the Sermon on the Mount, meaning amongst the Jews and not the Christians, because he didn't go far enough. And Hegel understands what he's doing also as an emancipation of Western thought from residual Judaism and how it thinks about the world, too much attention to thingness, etc. Marx, if you read his early writings, well, his infamous writings, for example, on the Jewish question, he equates capitalism with Judaism. He treats capitalism as a way in which Christians Judaize. So when Christians, he says, alienate their free labor to money, to some object of exchange, they become Jews, he says, and thereby they generate Judaism, this is his phrase, not mine, from their own intestines. In other words, the whole kind of system of capitalism is imagined as a Christian alienation of freedom and of the right attitude towards the world to Judaism and the wrong attitude towards the world.
Wow. Paola, do you see any of this in earlier Purification or, there's not a Reformation in the medieval period, but there are certainly movements that try to make Christianity better. Is that already operative there?
Absolutely. So everyone's familiar with the Spanish Inquisition, for example, and it was predated by an institution known as the Papal Inquisition. Both of these sought to sort of monitor and purify the beliefs and practices of the Christian flock. And the Spanish Inquisition in particular, which is the best known Inquisition, it's usually what people are referring to when they refer to the Inquisition. This is established in 1478 by Ferdinand and Isabella, King and Queen of Spain, specifically in response to the existence at that point in the Iberian Peninsula of hundreds of thousands of baptized Jews who either personally or their ancestors had converted to Christianity, who are suspected of still keeping Jewish practices and beliefs, even though outwardly they live as Christians. And even though in reality, the religiosity of the conversos, as these converts were called, was diverse and complex, especially when you zoom out and we're talking about many decades and more. So it's really tough to generalize. And there were devout Christians and there were for sure crypto Jews and every mixture in between. All conversos were suspect on account of their Jewish family history, if not ancestry. So we have this whole institution that is established by the king and queen with the blessing of the Pope that establishes tribunals across Spain. Later, this will spread to everywhere that Spain has colonies. Portugal will have an inquisition. It will have tribunals in Goa, in India, in Brazil. All of this continues into the early modern period and beyond, but it's established in the first place in Portugal as in Brazil because of this sense of great discomfort that Jews have now entered the interior of Christian society, and even though they're baptized, they're still in some sense Jews, and something has to be done to investigate their beliefs and practices and either set them right or eliminate these individuals in order to purify the Christian flock and protect it from this perceived threat of pollution and corruption. So later on, the Spanish Inquisition will go on to prosecute Moriscos, who are baptized Muslims who are suspected of still keeping Islam, and other perceived wayward Christians. But this all begins, and for its first 50 years, the operations of the Spanish Inquisition are focused on individuals who have Jewish ancestry. And it has an enormous impact, I would say, on subsequent European history and religious history as an institution. So I know that that's more of a social history answer to the question, not so much an intellectual history answer. But
I'd love to jump in on that, because I love the Spanish Inquisition, and it's wonderful to hear it presented as a reform movement, certainly a purity movement. But I think I would stick by this claim I made earlier that every Christian reform movement at some point presents itself as overcoming the Judaism of its enemies. So, and if you think about monastic movements, so now we're not talking about Jews, we're talking about, for example, the Cluniac monks, and then there's the Cistercian monks and the Franciscan monks, and so on and so forth. They tend to criticize what they see as wrong with their others, the predecessors or their opponents, in terms of Judaism. So, for example, Bernard of Clairvaux attacking Cluniac monks as building synagogues because they have decoration in their churches. This kind of critique, where you take whatever aspect of the relation to faith in your opponent, your Christian opponent, that you see as impure or not pure enough or in need of reform, and you present it as Jewish in order to articulate why it needs to be reformed, is true of, I would say, every Christian reform movement already from the early church.
Right, and it's like a move that's already present in the scriptures, so it becomes a familiar one.
Right.
I'm listening to you guys talk about the kind of consistency over time. I'm thinking about the very real Jewish people who suffered on account of this. I mean, you, Paola, were talking about the Inquisition. And I mean, I'm not a medievalist, but I've heard lots of stories about the real, torture and suffering that people endured. How did Jews understand anti-Judaism? Jews who suffered on account of it? And are there traces of their responses?
Absolutely. So anti-Judaism had an enormous impact on the real lives of real Jews in medieval Europe. And in extreme cases, in moments of crisis, it led to massacres, to forced conversions to Christianity, and to expulsions of Jews from England, from southern France, eventually from Spain. So I'll address the impact and Jewish responses to those very critical and extreme situations in a moment. But I also think it's important to remember that the ways in which anti-Judaism manifested in daily life also took a really serious toll on Jewish psyche and the way Jews went about their lives in Christian Europe. So although Christians and Jews often coexisted in peace in Christian Europe, and although Jewish communities had considerable autonomy in Christian Europe, they ultimately lived at the mercy of their Christian rulers and neighbors. And over time, many laws were enacted that restricted Jewish life. They weren't always followed in practice, but Jews were supposed to wear distinguishing badges so that they wouldn't be mistaken as Christians. They weren't supposed to have professions in which they had power over Christians. They sometimes were herded into town squares or into their own synagogues and forced to hear humiliating Christian conversionary sermons. And I think that last but not least, they also were confronted with all around them material culture that spoke to the power and ostensible success of Christianity and its culture. So there's church spires towering above them and church bells tolling the hour and Christian processions in the streets and Sundays and Christian holidays marking the calendar. And all of this could have a negative impact, as one can imagine, on Jewish morale. So Jewish responses ranged widely. For example, to go back to more extreme situations, which increased in frequency toward the end of the Middle Ages. In the face of conversion at sword's point, some Jews are known to have chosen death over baptism, especially as memorialized in Northern European Ashkenazi chronicles, liturgical poetry, books of remembrance. These individuals are celebrated and remembered as martyrs. There are also Jews who were baptized in the midst of anti-Christian violence, and sometimes they tried to return to Judaism, often encountering incredible difficulties. And those who remained in Christian society often met a very cold response and were regarded with suspicion. And in terms of the daily toll of everyday anti-Judaism, we have evidence of some Jews beginning to doubt the truth and superiority of Judaism. And we also know that some Jews took pen to paper, so to speak, and penned anti-Christian polemics to strengthen their Jewish brethren against the temptations and the pressures of the dominant Christian society. So Jews responded and were affected in intellectual and emotional and psychological and religious ways. It shaped, I would say, every aspect of Jewish life, including family life and the types of stories that one would tell by the fire when there were no members of other religions around. Anti-Judaism, I think, was really formative for a Jewish life, both in times of relative calm in medieval Europe, but for sure in moments of crisis, which unleashed violence against Jews, which then were memorialized in communal texts that were revisited on a regular basis.
You know, I'm listening to you and how deep this is, and how much this must have affected, you know, Jews through the generations. I can't help but wonder, like, what do we do with these stories about Jews, especially in early modern, but I'm sure also in medieval, who led more privileged lives as being associated with royal power or with seigneurial power? How did anti-Jewish ideas, how do we square that there were Jews who were always close to kings or royal power?
And you aren't, you're putting names to your questions.
Oh, sorry.
I'm
making eye contact with my screen.
You know, it's one of the very interesting, I'm fascinated by Paola's answer to your previous question, and by how persistent the ways of coping are across time, even to, I know this isn't the question you just asked, but I'm thinking of the joke about the Weimar Jew, or the early in National Socialism, the Jew walks into a cartographer's shop and says, "Give me a map of the world so I can see where I should emigrate to." And then he looks at the map for a while and he says, "Do you have a map of a different world?" Because there's nowhere in which there isn't anti-Judaism. And there's a similar comment that Nachmanides makes, so a 13th century very important Spanish scholar, Jewish scholar, when he's asked, he explains the passage in which Jacob divides his flocks when he's afraid of meeting Esau. He divides his flocks into many, and Nachmanides says, this is because in every age, many different kings seek to destroy us, so we must be dispersed across the world so that some fragment will survive if when that hatred arises in other parts of the world. So these kinds of ideas, whether they are conversion or reform, or which are also ways in which Jews have reacted to anti-Judaism, or to this idea of dispersal as a protection against, these are timeless, and that's kind of scary to think. So Paola, your answer really provoked some anxiety in me. But it is interesting that that Jews become identified with kings or with lords, with power, and power becomes identified with Jews. And that happens really early. I mean, if you think of, say, the Gospel of John, in which the princes of this world are in cahoots with the Jews to oppose Jesus, right? And in which the Jews are actually the spawn of Satan, John 8:44, and as part of the princes of this world. So there's actually even, you know, a kind of cosmic struggle in which the Jews and the princes of this world are opposed to the Christians. That's already in the gospel, but it's really only in the Middle Ages that the kind of institutional structures that lend this kind of thinking, I think, real power arise. And that has a lot to do with this short period of time in England, only about 100 years, for example, in which Jews, a very small number of Jews are brought in to do money lending, say in Anglo-Norman in England, and then the king taxes or takes from the Jews the money that they lend, that they recuperate from their borrowers, and uses that as a way of building royal power. So, you know, kings in the Middle Ages, they didn't have many rights to tax. And when they discovered that they could use Jews as moneylenders and then take the profits not as a tax, but as a seizing from the Jews, they did that. And all of a sudden, royal power and Judaism become linked in the protest imagination. So you see like cartoons of the King of England wearing with a Jew's nose or circumcised, right? Trying to conflate the abuses of power as they're seen by protest citizens and the Jews. And that becomes a very powerful motif in which Jews are seen as kind of the agents of power, and power is seen as Judaized or Judaizable, right? Criticized in terms of its Jewishness. And I would say that from the Middle Ages on, certainly in Western Europe, but also in many Islamic societies, many kings, princes, caliphs, viziers, etc., are criticized as Jews, Jew lovers, favoring Jews, acting like Jews, all the way into the modern world. So, you know, again, Weimar is a great example, and so are the French Republic. The French Republic is another example in which that was used. But even in the Syrian civil war today, or until very recently, every group in that civil war has accused the other one of being Jewish, Jew lover, Zionist, etc. Right? So it's a very common strategy in the struggle for power to associate the power you're criticizing with Judaism and exploit that stereotype of Jews as agents of a corrupt power.
It's such a deep pattern, right, that you're showing goes back thousands of years. I wonder, you know, maybe as a final question from me back to Paola, you laid out so beautifully these categories of stereotypes from the medieval world. Which of them do you see as most resonant, continuing to resonate today?
So I think that most of them continue to resonate today. I know that personally, I've most recently been struck by the allegations that Jews are responsible for spreading the coronavirus. And when one looks at those anti-Jewish caricatures, when one sees the virus represented as Jews or Jews as the virus, when one reads about the notion that Jews or Israel manufactured the virus in order to somehow gain global control, or that Jews are looking forward to or are already profiting from the vagaries of the market or hoping to profit from the vaccine, to a medievalist, this is so familiar. I mentioned earlier the association in the Middle Ages between Jews and disease and the notion that Jews spread disease, for example, or the notion that there's a Jewish conspiracy to harm non-Jews. And this just seems like transposing that into modern contemporary times. Of course, in the medieval world, it was understood as specifically, these alleged Jewish misdeeds were understood as specifically anti-Christian. So today, that's just more generalized in our more secular world. But that would be one example, but I'm sure David can speak to many others, and a very prominent one is the notion that Jews exert financial control, for example. But again, I think it comes back to this notion that Jews are threatening to non-Jews, and they're in cahoots with one another in trying to harm non-Jews. But many of the specific themes are very recognizable, and in learning, I think that's one of the ways that when we teach about anti-Semitism, one can make the most difference is by sensitizing students to the antiquity and the weight and the history of these tropes and these themes, so that when they come across them, they don't just think it's something new or describing something that happened, but they recognize them for what they are, which is just recycling worn and familiar and storied and tragic sort of stereotypes. So
yeah, so I was just reading some news thing today about some evil deed that Jews were financing, and I think a lot of what I'm hearing in this program allows us to just see that extremely deep context for that. So many times when we read news stories, we miss that. We just get caught up in the facts. Did they or didn't they? And don't understand this is building on a very, very old tradition. I want to open up to questions. I promised I would leave lots of time for student questions. There is a set of student questions that Dr. Nadel sent me ahead of time from her class. Her class read Professor Nurenberg's New Yorker article, which is a little more contemporary. So I'm going to begin with these because I have them already with a couple of these. And so don't everyone be shell-shocked that we're going to jump a little bit more modern, but our answers right now were a little more modern, so I think it's all right. This comes from a student in Dr. Nadel's class named Laura. Laura writes, why, David, do you think, what is it about anti-Judaism that makes it appeal across the political spectrum today? Why is this not just on the right or just on the left?
I'm so sorry that that's true, because in a way, when it's true, it's not always true. And when it's true, it's the most dangerous moment. But I think the why has a bit to do with what I was talking about earlier in terms of our ideals. So why colonialism and overcoming colonialism has come to take the form of thinking about overcoming certain Jewish actions in the world, in this case, Zionism. Why Zionism has become the symbol for the attempt to improve the world by overcoming colonialism, which is an ideal, I think, certainly the entire left shares, right? Why it takes that form, that has a lot to do with the work it's put to do in the politics of different moments. Because these questions are always out there, and the possibility of bringing the Jews to bear. And this is why I resist a little bit saying it's all persistent. It is persistent. The forms are there. The habits of thought that make anti-Judaism potentially useful to jump into a really powerful phase are always there, but it's not always a powerful phase. And what we need to understand, and what's really hard to understand, is why sometimes it becomes really powerful, useful for right and left, and at other times it's actually quite muted and might be very useful for a small group or for a particular movement, but doesn't become a kind of universal language. And I think it's a legitimate question to ask when you're studying any anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish act. Is this just, the expression of a particular subject position that has this attitude towards Jews or towards Judaism that I can understand? So, for example, when Palestinians legitimately say that they are being, oppressed, that we should interpret that differently, I think, than we should interpret, say, a French Muslim resident of the Paris banlieue, of the Paris suburbs, understanding his or her oppression within France as the product of the Jews. And we should understand even that differently than we understand, an activist in some branch of American politics on the left or on the right making this similar claims. So at some point, the particular starts to become kind of universal, and anti-Semitism starts to have a kind of universal power. And it did in the 1930s. It wasn't just Germany. Germany would not have succeeded if anti-Semitism hadn't been widely generalized in the societies it chose to occupy and engage, both Muslim and Christian. And it knew that, and it mobilized that. And we're maybe living, it's hard to tell. It's always too early to tell if we're living in a moment in which right and left and center are kind of coalescing around the utility of ideas about Judaism to do political work in the present that puts real Jews at danger.
Thank you. Another student from Dr. Nadel's class named Margaret wrote to ask a question about continuity in the claim that Jewish people are harming Christian children. And I actually wanted to ask you about that earlier, Paola, to kind of follow up on, you know, my students, whenever we talk about these claims that Jews kidnap and harm Christian children, my students are always amazed, like, how can that be such an important claim? Why is that part of the story over and over again? It seems so preposterous. And yet it even, you know, what Margaret's question hints at is that we even see it showing up today. Paola, what is it about this claim that's meaningful? Why is it so persistent?
I think on a fundamental level, the reason it's persistent over time is because of the way we feel toward children, which I'm not suggesting that it's been the same throughout history or is now in all places, but children are the most quote unquote innocent. They can't protect themselves and they are the future. And the notion of someone taking your child just gets you in a way and instills fear in you in a way that's super powerful and can spread like wildfire in a sense. And so I think it had a lot of power to quickly galvanize anti-Jewish feelings in communities that perhaps otherwise, you know, weren't so engaged in some of those stories or sentiments in a given moment. I think that because at least the way that ritual murder and then blood libel accusations developed in Christian Europe as reenactments of the crucifixion of Christ or as attempts to in some way seek vengeance against Christians for Jewish suffering. This also plugs into religious convictions on the part of Christians in particular. Now, obviously, Jesus was a grown man when he was crucified. These are small children, so this is a crucial difference between the story in the Gospels and what's associated with it in these accusations that are false against Jews. And in the medieval period, there's another piece to this that I don't know of a counterpart in the modern period, which is, you know, these children often had never existed, or they're discovered, you know, Jews clearly had nothing to do with anything that had happened to this child. Nevertheless, after all is said and done, pilgrims start to come and claim that miracles or first miracles are said to have occurred and have been performed by the allegedly deceased, allegedly murdered child. And so in a sense, the child is portrayed as representing the ultimate triumph over Christianity, over Jewish cruelty. And so the whole story becomes one of instruction to Christian medieval audiences, where the Jews are a placeholder for religious doubt, religious crime, cruelty, opposition, and showing how what ultimately matters is that in the end, Christ wins and Christ saves. And so even though real Jews end up suffering and being burned to death and persecuted because of these false accusations, as these stories get repeated, they also have a separate purpose, which is to reassure Christians about the ultimate truth and superiority and triumph of their faith over anything any evil Jews could perpetrate. So that's a little bit all over the place as an answer. But I think there's the child piece, and there are other pieces I haven't mentioned either. And there are religious components, and I'm less well-versed in contemporary manifestations. I mean, of course, I know about Edgardo Mortara, but that's not exactly contemporary. But these are all connected.
Just one piece in passing, when you started talking about Jesus in your answer briefly, I got this flash of did I not even ask? How can anti-Judaism be so central to Western tradition, given that Jesus Christ was born a Jew? What do you make of that? How does that fit in? This is not even a question from the audience. I just inserted my own. Paola, what do you make of that?
how can anti-Judaism be so central to Christianity when Christianity's central figure is a Jew? Absolutely. So I think it has to do with the way that Christianity developed out of Judaism, out of a Jewish tradition, and had to, in its early years, begin to differentiate itself from Judaism. And as David began to mention earlier, one way in which it does so is to construct a set of dichotomies between itself and everything that is Jewish, in which Judaism is the negative foil. So it's a very complicated and ambivalent relationship between the two faiths or traditions or communities, where on the one hand, Christianity is fully aware and cognizant and recognizes that it's building on Jewish traditions, and they understand Jesus as fulfilling the prophecies of the Jewish prophets, etc., and they include the Jewish Bible in their own scriptures. But Jews themselves miss the boat. They are stubborn, they are blind, and then they are deicides, right? They're accused of killing Christ. And once you're a killer of Christ, you're on the side of Satan. They are explicitly linked to Satan, for example, in the Gospel of John. And it becomes a great irony and paradox. You're absolutely right, and a great tension that is very complicated.
Yeah. Okay, I have another student question that's come in from Jacob Katz, who is a student of Professor Brenner. And his question, I guess, maybe let's ask this of David. Were these stereotypes consistent across the Christian world? Was it the same in Eastern Orthodox countries, or is this more a Catholic phenomenon? I think most of the areas that Paola mentioned were in Catholic Europe, but David, earlier you had mentioned, no, we see this in Islam too. How far can we push our story? Like how far do these stereotypes extend?
Well, it really depends on which stereotype. Everyone has its own fascinating history, but that's a fantastic question, because in fact you can show how the stereotypical imagination, and I'll use stereotype here, quite literally, migrates from Byzantium, from the Greek Orthodox world, in images and stories about Jews abusing the Virgin and Child, or images of the Virgin and Child, and you can watch them migrate into Spanish manuscripts like the Cantigas de Santa Maria, or English manuscripts, French manuscripts, and you can see Western Europe learning an iconography of anti-Judaism from Byzantine material. So it's really fascinating to watch the migration of these stories. They do arise in different places. And even the child story is fascinating, because if you think about the first 1,000 years of Christianity in the West, that story never arises. There's no accusation of Jews in the West for the first 1,000 years killing Christian children, right? And it arises when it does, partly because of changes in devotion, an increase in the importance of Mary and the infant Jesus in devotional practices. And then it really takes off in part for reasons that have a lot to do with Facebook. That is to say, media revolutions, the printing press. The story of Trent, Simon of Trent, which becomes the most important child, it gets disseminated all over Eastern Europe and Western Europe too, because it's printed on the newly invented printing press. And so media has a lot to do with how some of these stories become much more powerful, much larger than they ever were in the Middle Ages. I mean, I'm with Paola I'm sure that there are some people who argue that ritual murder charges and accusations were rare in Spain, for example. Rarer than they were in the Holy Roman Empire, the German-speaking lands. And I'm with Paola. I don't know, Paola, if you would say this, but having read your new book, I think you would, that there really were very powerful ideas about that in Spain too, even if some scholars who specialize more in the rest of Europe think that there weren't. But they were different. They did have a different history in different regions, and they had a different iconography. And then you can kind of watch that history and that iconography merge as ideas spread across the continent, sometimes from, for example, Byzantium to Western Europe. And you can certainly watch them spread from Christianity to Islam. So one of the products of colonialism, of Christian colonialism in the Islamic world, is the sudden rise of ritual murder accusations against Jews in Islam.
Wow. And can I push you one step further with a question from my AU colleague, Boaz Atzili from the School of International Service? He writes, if much of the anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish ideas emanate from religious ideas in Christianity or Islam, why do these ideas become compelling for atheists and even anti-religious people like in Marxism? You know, shouldn't they be anti-Jewish?
Is that a follow-up or a question to Paola?
I think it's a follow-up probably.
Okay, no, wonderful. I mean, I think it has precisely to do with what I was talking about earlier in terms of our ideals. So when we learn to articulate our ideals in certain ways, like transcendence as an ideal and selflessness and overcoming the desires of the body for some higher, right? Then our secular ideals look like those too. It's not like all of a sudden when we start to secularize, we break from everything we knew before. On the contrary, our sources, our traditions that convey to us our sources of value get translated in new ways. And some of those ways are secular, not all, right? And a lot of ink has been spilled on, for example, what Hegel took from Christianity, or how Christian he remained, what Marx took from Hegel's Christianity, or what Marx took from the Christianity around him, what the Bolsheviks took from Eastern Orthodoxy. There's no break, sudden emancipation. Even the French Revolution and its secular move imagined a lot of its ideals in terms of a kind of in Christian terms. So it's really, I don't think, we keep on saying that a revolution is a total change in thought, but actually there's always these deep continuities, and that's what makes history so useful and so important. If it were possible for us to suddenly break with all of the past, invent a new language that has nothing to do with the concepts and prejudgments of our past language, be born into a culture that had none of the habits of previous cultures, well, I think that would be pretty horrible, but that's just not the way humans are. Every word we use carries with it a history. Nietzsche said, every word is a prejudice, right? Because every word has been used in certain ways and conveys certain meanings and potential meanings, and we're chained by that. We can play with it, there's creativity, there's change, but it's not like we can just say goodbye to the past. And religions have played an enormous role in shaping that past, shaping every ideal that, you know, Western Europe has had, mostly Christian, or that the Islamic world has had, and the interaction between them. So I would say that the secular doesn't ever fully emancipate itself from the great traditions of values and ideals that they developed from. Even if, and I don't agree that our world is secular, by the way. There's many, 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 many people for whom whose ideals and values are still expressed in religious terms throughout the world.
I'm struck by what you're saying about history, that you know, history shows us these deep continuities, but also our study of history. I mean, one of the things I take from this conversation, and my hope for all of our scholarship on anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, is that by becoming aware of this history, right, gives us choices. So as we found our own attempts to reform the world, maybe we can be conscious not to step into these old tropes and just remobilize them. Quite a number of some of the questions that have come in, including ahead of time, were about what should we do? What do you recommend we do? So I thought I know you're historians, and historians in general are shy about questions like that. So that's my answer to that, which is our study of the past can help us make choices better, more informed choices. But I wonder if either of you want to jump in on a what should we do question. Paola?
I have to say that at the moment, I'm more pessimistic than optimistic, so I don't know if it's good for me to speak on this question, because I keep becoming more and more aware of how knowledge is not always the answer. And I teach in the hope that exactly, as you're saying, understanding better history will make us more self-aware about our habits and our ways of thinking, and enable us to realize that we have alternatives and we can make different choices. And part of me definitely hopes that and believes it. On the other hand, often people act in ways in spite of knowledge, and in spite of knowing the other, and in spite of knowing about the other. I'll just say that part of my quest for an answer to your question is that one of the choices for the final paper that I assigned to students in my anti-Semitism survey has to do with, if you had all the resources you needed and you were given 1 year to try to turn the tide against anti-Semitism in the United States, what kind of a program would you set up, or would it not be a program? What would you do? What do you think would be the steps to take to deeply change Americans, just taking the United States, minds, or educate them, or whatever you think is the right approach? And so I encourage my students to explore this, and I'll let you know if anybody ever comes up with something that I think would actually be impactful. But I'm with you, Lisa, and that's my hope.
Yeah. I think, but I also hear in your answer how torn, I recognize myself in it too, that there is this sense that no amount of knowledge is enough as we see around us, the world, seeming to embrace something like this.
In the end, sometimes I almost feel like the most important thing is recognizing common humanity across all differences, and that's not even specifically about anti-Semitism. I heard a very powerful webinar with Susanna Heschel. It was on anti-racism the other evening, and it was more of a spiritual than an academic approach to many of the challenges facing our society right now. And it was very, very powerful. And in some ways I felt more empowered by it than sometimes I feel from some of my academic activities in terms of hope for the future of our society regarding these very complex issues.
David, do you want to weigh in here?
I was hoping you'd forget me.
For you too. Go ahead.
I was hoping you'd forget me, since this is such a hard one.
Well, I can also aim a different kind of hard question at you. How about this one from Tamar? David, how do you distinguish between anti-Judaism and critical disagreement?
Yeah,
She
actually,
says,
yeah, those are the same question.
Yeah.
In a way. And I think here, I guess I feel very much like Paola, just so well articulated, and like you also articulated, Lisa, that how have Jews dealt with anti-Semitism? One of the ways they dealt with anti-Semitism is by scholarship, by trying to show why those ideas exist, by a kind of forensic analysis that tries also to show why they were mistaken when they arose, that the Q of Lincoln was not killed by Jews, right? This kind of thing. By trying to intervene in these debates through providing better knowledge in the Enlightenment hope that good knowledge drives out bad knowledge. And I think that there's lots of reasons to believe that Enlightenment hope isn't true, that good knowledge doesn't always drive out bad knowledge. And one of the reasons has to do with kind of the way in which we inherit certain concepts which we have a hard time not crediting, not using, habits of thought, I call them. So to Tamara, I'd say, the way you can't ever be fully sure whether there's a difference between, whether you've got right the difference between anti-Judaism and criticism. But if the criticism looks a lot like preconceptions, and if it can, seems to withstand the solvent of other perspectives in ways that looks like, projection onto the Jews of things that are, then you're distinguishing between anti-Judaism and criticism, right? You can never be totally sure. And that's why I said it really depends on who's doing the speaking, right? I do think there's a difference between who the criticism is coming from. If criticism about a certain, well, I won't go further. I just think to the degree we become conscious of the history of our concepts, we're in a better position to ask, is the reason I'm thinking this or criticizing the world in this way because I'm in the grips of preconception, of prejudice, or, you know, or have I got it right? Or is it some mixture of both? So but what do we do about that? If we really believe that these preconceptions are so powerful and that good knowledge doesn't necessarily drive out bad, then it's easy to fall into, I think, the kind of despair I hear Paola talking about a little bit, and I think many of us are feeling similar despair. I would say almost every graduate student and academic in the humanities feels this despair, which is, you know, my academic work, how does it change the world? Can it change the world? And it doesn't have to be anti-Semitism, the question you worried about. It can be racism, it can be anything, right? It can be actually quite different. You can believe that that the values that held this world together and that we should all cleave to are being dissolved by the left. I mean, it doesn't matter what your view is, how can the academic contribute? And that's a really hard question I think we're all facing as scholars and students today. And one of the answers may have a little to do with, I think, you know, Paola was also getting at, with media. If we rethink the relationship between our practice and other forms of intervention in the world. It's like, what's the relationship between Paola's work as a scholar of ritual murder accusations in medieval Europe and the kinds of stories that could make a difference if deployed on Facebook today? I mean, we know ritual murder accusations are being deployed on Facebook today. It's actually a very distressing aspect of the past of these ideas, that they're very powerful in social media today. Well, what would an academic's contribution to social media look like that could perhaps have an impact on that? Should we be trying to translate our research into TikTok videos or YouTube shorts or you know, Facebook? I mean, how do we, because good knowledge doesn't drive out bad knowledge, in part because good knowledge isn't taking a form that can disseminate. It can't memify. And, you know, partly that's because we are just what I've just been saying is so much longer than a tweet, right? But I do think we need to think actively as students and as teachers and as Facebook executives about how we take knowledge and try to turn it into good knowledge, right? And you will say, well, how do you determine the difference between good knowledge and bad knowledge? And that's a question that every social media platform is thinking about right now, right? But I think we don't have to make that decision for the world. What we have to think about is, how do I take my knowledge? Are there ways in which I can take my knowledge and make it more accessible to the world? And that, I think, is something we haven't been doing as academics. We haven't even been doing it in the classroom as much as we should. And we need to do more.
What you said speaks so beautifully to one of our questions that came in from scholars, Saskia Conan-Snyder from University of South Carolina, who writes, and it's so much echoing what you just said, David, how can we best address the power and harm of modern anti-Semitism with our social media conscious undergraduates, most of whom don't read the New Yorker? What? Not the New Yorker? Or solid historical research or any legitimate newspaper. They already come into our classes with stereotypes that are difficult to dismantle. So much of our time in the classroom is about undoing harm already done. Paola, I know you're in the classroom this semester and that you teach on anti-Semitism. How do you ever see these stereotypes come out in the classroom, and what do you do about them?
I was shocked at the beginning so I'm teaching remotely, and that's a new experience in some ways, but I went around my class, and this semester I'm just teaching an intro to Jewish history, and I asked everybody, why did you take this class? Why did you choose to enroll in this class? And one person said, he said, because I know that Jews are good in business, and I want to learn more about how they got to be that way. And everyone just sort, I mean, it was hard to tell on the internet, but nobody else had given an answer like that ever before. And I just said, well, that's an interesting stereotype. We're going to talk more about that this semester and where that idea comes from. And I, on my feet and with everybody else there, and it's being recorded, I'm just like, oh my God. But that's an example where an anti-Semitic stereotype, this individual had, I guess, no sense of the resonances of that. But I think that one way I am changing in the classroom, hoping to have more of an impact on the world, is to make space for students to look into their own lives and experiences and make connections between those and the materials that we are covering in class, to think about ways in which in their own lives, when have they experienced, had an experience involving the intersection of race or ethnicity and religion, for example, that was formative for them, and how was it formative, and how has it informed their sense of hope or lack of hope, or their vision for the future, or just to try to get them to do some introspection and almost storytelling as a way of creating community within the class to the extent that people are comfortable sharing, and also some realizing, because sometimes I think to the instructor the links might be obvious, but to the students they might not be, between the material that's the subject of the course and the themes that are relevant to the present. And so I think making it more personally relevant, explicitly so, and making space for students to reflect on their own experiences can be a way to really get them to tune into what's going on in the classroom.
And I think also a lot of what we heard from both of you today is about how deeply ingrained in our culture, just this basic structure of overcoming Judaism, it's so deeply ingrained that it may be that certain, I think of your students saying that you don't even realize you're being anti-Semitic. It's such a just reflex sometimes. And that, there's an opportunity when there are these unguarded mistakes that students certainly did not mean. I'm sure your student did.
Right, I didn't want to embarrass them and make them drop the class.
Right, but then it becomes, I remember in my very first paper I ever assigned, in the first course I ever taught at my first job, a student wrote, ever since the Jews were expelled from their land in ancient times for having killed Jesus, and I just looked at it and I was like, oh, what am I, like, here it is, a moment. This is it, break it, am I make or break? What do you say? How do you keep someone engaged, but challenge false information and make them understand that this is part of an old tradition that they surely don't want to be part of, and with that education, then they can go and help educate. We are sadly reaching the end of our time together. And there are many more questions sitting in the chat that we did not get to. I would say a number of those questions have to do with other parts of the world and other times with anti-Semitism. For all of you who asked those questions, you are in luck, because future panels will address those very questions. So please stay tuned and come back. Next week, our program is called Was America Ever the Exception? And that's September 17th from 12:55 to 2:10 p.m. I hope you can all make it. Please, everyone, join me once again in thanking our panelists, Paola Tartakoff and David Nurenberg, for a wonderful panel. And I will see everyone next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.